It was October 12th, 1965, and the morning fog over Des Moines tasted like damp iron and wood smoke. I was kneeling in the flowerbed behind our white picket fence, my nightgown soaked through with the heavy autumn dew. In my right hand, I held a rusted tin box that once contained peppermint tea, now heavy with 3 letters and a single gold cufflink. In my left, a garden spade. My husband, Thomas, was still asleep upstairs, his steady breathing the only sound in a house built on a foundation of silence. I had exactly 5 minutes before the whistling of the tea kettle would signal the start of another decade of duty. I didn't pray as I pushed the metal spade into the cold, black Iowa soil. I didn't cry. I simply buried the only version of myself that had ever truly been alive. As the dirt covered the metal lid with a dull, hollow thud, I knew that for the rest of my life I would be a ghost haunting my own kitchen. But the real horror wasn't the burying. It was the realization that I wasn't the only one in that house keeping a shovel ready. To understand why I was kneeling in the dirt that morning, you have to look back at the Tuesday before. It was the day I always spent ironing Thomas's white shirts in the humid basement. The air was thick with the scent of hot starch and the rhythmic hiss of steam against cotton. I was reaching into the pocket of his charcoal gray Sunday coat, expecting to find a stray nickel, when my fingers brushed against a heavy cream-colored envelope. It wasn't addressed to Thomas. It was addressed to me, mailed from a town in Ohio I hadn't seen in 12 years. A town where I wasn't a dutiful wife or a mother, but a girl who once believed in the impossible. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was the bold, cursive script of a man who should have been a memory, but was instead a living ghost. Tucked inside that envelope was a single gold cufflink, the identical twin to the one I had kept hidden in the velvet lining of my jewelry box for over a decade. It was returned now without a word of explanation, a silent, metallic piece of evidence that my past wasn't dead. It was just waiting. The letter spoke of a meeting at the Des Moines station on Friday, 3:15 p.m., a one-way ticket out of the gray. But then I heard a floorboard creak above me. Thomas wasn't at the factory. He was standing at the top of the basement stairs, watching the steam rise. "Everything all right down there, Mary?" His voice was like gravel, flat and unreadable. I shoved the letter into my apron, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Just a stubborn wrinkle, Thomas," I managed to say. That was the first micro crack in the foundation. I realized then that my safety was an illusion, and the man I shared a bed with was a stranger I had been over-polishing for years. I spent the next 3 days in a fever of domestic perfection, scrubbing floors until my knuckles bled, all while that gold cufflink burned a hole in my pocket. I had the train timetable memorized from a hidden scrap of paper I'd found at the pharmacy. Friday, 3:15 p.m. No connections. No looking back. Every time Thomas looked at me over the rim of his coffee cup, I felt the weight of the shovel I hadn't used yet. Life in Des Moines was a monument to things that didn't move. We had a lawn that looked like a green velvet carpet, trimmed every Saturday with the precision of a military haircut. Inside, the air always carried the faint, sharp sting of lemon wax and the heavy, slow-cooked scent of a pot roast simmering. It was the olfactory blueprint of a good life. Thomas would come home at 5:30 sharp, the engine of his car ticking as it cooled in the driveway. He always smelled of the factory floor, a mixture of cold grease and oxidized steel. He was a man of few words, the kind who never forgot an anniversary, but never remembered to ask what I was thinking when I stared at the rain-streaked kitchen window for too long. Our 1965 Buick Electra sat in the garage like a sleeping beast, its black paint polished until it mirrored the gray Iowa sky. I would sit in the passenger seat, my white-gloved hands folded like a prayer in my lap, watching the reflection of the street lamps slide over the hood like ghosts. On Thursday night, the tension finally snapped. I was setting the table when Thomas reached out and caught my wrist. He didn't squeeze, but he didn't let go. "You've been quiet, Mary. More than usual." He looked toward the backyard, toward the patch of earth where I would eventually bury my heart. For a second, I thought he knew. I thought he'd found the twin cufflink in my vanity. The silence in the room became so heavy I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, like a scream. "It's just the change of the season, Thomas," I whispered. He let go, but the way he looked at the back door told me the borders of my cage were tightening. I realized then that I wasn't just choosing between two men. I was choosing between a life of quiet lies and a truth that would burn the house down. The 3:15 whistle on that Friday afternoon didn't just signal a train leaving the station. It signaled the end of the woman I might have been. I stood in the kitchen, my suitcase packed and hidden in the pantry, and listened until the sound was nothing more than a vibration in the floorboards. I didn't go. I chose the salt for the potatoes over the wind in my hair. I chose the silence. For the next 40 years, that silence became the most loyal companion I ever had. Sturdier than Thomas, more consistent than the Iowa seasons. The 1970s were heavy, a decade of wood-paneled walls and the grainy flicker of the evening news. While the world outside was burning with protests, our house remained a fortress of undisturbed routine. Thomas grew thicker around the middle, his hands permanently calloused. He bought a gold-colored Le Sabre in 1974, but it never felt as honest as the 65 Electra. We spent our evenings in matched vinyl recliners, the blue light of the television washing over our faces like a cold, incoming tide. This was the golden cage era, where we had everything we were told to want and nothing that made us feel alive. I became a master of the ghost walk, moving through the house without leaving a footprint. The 1980s were hollow. The children, Sarah and David, moved to Chicago and Denver to build lives that didn't smell of starch and machine oil. The house grew cavernous, the silence shifting from a comfort to a physical weight. I watched them play on that very patch of grass, their small bare feet running over the exact spot where the rusted tea tin lay 3 feet beneath the topsoil. Sometimes, while hanging damp laundry, the wooden pins clicking between my teeth, I would find myself staring at that corner of the garden. The geraniums always flourished there with an unusual strength. It was as if the soil was feeding on the life I had refused to live. I realized then that my children were the only things I had produced that weren't made of secrets. And yet, they didn't really know me at all. The 1990s were fragile. Thomas retired, and his constant presence in the house felt like a disruption of a carefully balanced, decades-old ecosystem. He took up woodworking in the basement. The sharp, clean smell of cedar shavings replaced the scent of the factory. We became experts in the art of the comfortable pause, communicating through the rhythmic clink of silverware and the dry rustle of the morning paper. But then, his strength began to leak out of him. I spent my days in hospital corridors that smelled of floor wax and antiseptic, a scent that triggered a visceral, painful memory of my 1965 kitchen. I sat by his bed, holding his hand, a hand that had provided for me, yet never truly known the woman sitting beside him. On his final night, he pulled me close and whispered something I'll never forget. "I always knew about the box, Mary. I just didn't want to know what was inside." The world stopped. 40 years of carefully constructed walls came crashing down in a single breath. He had known. He had lived in that silence with me, guarding my secret just as I guarded his ignorance. When Thomas passed away on a Tuesday, the same day of the week I had found that letter 30 years prior, the silence of the house changed once more. It was no longer a shared burden. It was mine alone. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing on the oak floors I had polished for half a century. I looked at the heavy drapes and the Buick still sitting in the garage, and I realized that I hadn't just endured. I had been a participant in a long, slow suicide of the spirit. Des Moines is a different city now. The skyline has grown glass teeth that bite into the clouds. I am 89 years old, a collection of brittle bones and memories held together by a floral print house dress. The house on 42nd Street is too quiet. Even the grandfather clock has finally stopped, its pendulum frozen like a heart that simply grew too tired to keep count. I sit in my chair by the window, watching the shadows stretch across the lawn. My children tell me I should move to a community where the grass is cut by strangers. They don't understand that I cannot leave. I am the self-appointed guardian of a grave that has no headstone. Yesterday, I felt the first true thaw of spring. It was the same smell that filled my lungs on that October morning in 1965. I found the old garden spade in the garage, tucked behind a stack of weathered cedar planks. It was heavy, the wooden handle gray and splintered. My walk to the back corner of the garden took longer than it used to. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. I reached the spot beneath the overgrown rose bushes, the place where I had once stood in a soaked nightgown. The digging was not an act of strength, but an act of surrender. I pushed the spade into the soft mud. When the metal blade finally struck something hard and hollow, clink. The sound vibrated up through my arms. It was the sound of a door unlocking after half a century. I knelt in the dirt and pulled the tea tin from the ground. It was a grotesque thing now, a jagged brownish husk that crumbled at the edges. But as I forced the lid open, the contents remained defiant. The 3 letters, wrapped in yellowed wax paper, were stained but legible, and there, nestled in the bottom, was the gold cufflink. I picked it up with trembling fingers. It still caught the weak light, reflecting a spark of a 1953 jazz club and of a man who had promised me that we would never be ordinary. I sat there on the grass for a long time. I thought of Thomas and his final confession. I wondered if we were both just waiting for the other to be brave enough to speak. The 3:15 train doesn't run anymore. The tracks are overgrown, and the station is a museum of a time that no longer exists. I looked at the letters, the bold, cursive script of a man who is now surely dust, and I realized that the woman who could have read them with a racing heart died a long time ago. I didn't cry. I simply held the gold cufflink against my cheek, feeling the cold reality of a decision that had finally reached its end. I didn't rebury the box. I left it there, open to the sky, its secrets exposed to the indifferent Iowa wind. I walked back to the house, leaving muddy footprints on the porch, and sat at the kitchen table. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the twin cufflink, the one I had kept in my jewelry box for a lifetime, and set it on the table next to the one I had just disinterred. They were a pair again, after 50 years of being apart. They sat there in the light, beautiful and useless, 2 pieces of gold that had cost me everything I never was. I closed my eyes and listened to the house. It wasn't the silence of a secret anymore. It was just the silence of a house that had finished its story. 50 years for 2 gold buttons,